thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Matt Dobson. I am here for E.H. Smith in our London Design Centre on St John Street. Just to say a quick word about that, if you don't know our design centre, you might be forgiven for having missed the news that it opened in 2020. And part of the reason for creating a facility like this here in London was to be able to host events like this. So under normal circumstances, we'd have loved to have seen you here in person for tonight's Wordsmiths event. The other traditional and obligatory plug is to say that we're on St John Street, we're up and running, and as soon as we're fully allowed to, we would look forward to welcoming you here and to show you around AHMM's work. Our speaker this evening is quite a unique architect. In 2014, his practice, Rael Sanfratello, with his partner Virginia Sanfratello, was named an emerging voice by the Architectural League of New York. The teeter-totter wall, which we'll be hearing more about tonight, was the recipient of the 2020 Design Museum's Design of the Year Award. And the practice itself, Rael Sanfratello, thrives on research, teaching, doing and questioning the world around us. In the case of the teeter-totter wall, to particular and great effect. So, Ronald, over to you and that quite enticing backdrop from a dark and fairly dreary London this evening. Quite jealous.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to see some familiar faces and to share a very different place with you this evening. And I'm just going to take you through a few projects that we've been working on over the last couple of years, and I'm going to contextualize it around a body of work I've been doing called Border Walls Architecture. And this is a book that I published right at the time when the leader of the previous regime in the United States took office, who ran on a platform that he would build a wall. But in fact, 700 miles of wall had already been built, and we had been working very hard documenting the stories that emerged as the consequence of the wall. And so this book, Border Walls Architecture, is sort of a biography of that wall and the spaces and people and ecologies that that wall has put in danger. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but for me, I contextualize where the borderlands are much more broadly. We think about the southernmost part of the United States as being the borderlands, that interface between the United States and Mexico. The borderlands, for me, are a place where languages and food and cultures and traditions rub up against each other in really interesting ways. It's a hybrid landscape where people speak two languages at the same time or make food that has these kind of hybrid qualities to them. Some bit of Mexican, some bit of food from the United States, belief systems, cultures. But my perspective of the borderlands is a little bit different. I'm coming to you from a very special place that is not adjacent to the contemporary borderlands, but is bordered by 14,000-foot mountains. It spans the border between the state of Colorado and the state of New Mexico, but it's also was the northernmost frontier of Mexico before the Mexican-American War in 1846. So the legacy of the borderlands is sort of sandwiched between these two worlds within what is now the United States. This red line above and the darker black line that defines the edge between Mexico. In this landscape, at the border of Colorado and New Mexico, the memory of that history of this as the borderlands continues to exist. There are houses made of mud, the towns have Spanish names, the people still speak Spanish, and those kind of customs, Mexican customs still exist. I'm actively restoring about 9 buildings that are made out of the land itself. And this is an important concept to think about. In the borderlands, there is a saying, las fronteras nos dividen, pero la tierra nos une. What that means in English is borders divide us, but the land unites us. And there's something really interesting about this landscape where the buildings and the ways that food is prepared and grown all connects to the land. And so this will be a theme that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But even my own house, which is a 5th generation house in the country, is made of mud. And I use this house as a platform where I can teach traditional and indigenous building practices, things like plastering a house in mud and what that is like, making mud bricks. We do this alongside the road in order to construct buildings, but also to construct something more. Now, horno is basically the Spanish word for oven. This is a technology that migrated from Europe to the Americas about 400 years ago, but it migrated to Spain from North Africa, and it migrated to North Africa from Iran, from India. And so it has a long legacy as a way of bringing people together around fire and food and creating community. I recently have been involved in a project called Pedacito de la Tierra. In English, that means a little piece of the earth. We've translated it as a little piece of home. The reason we do that is because this project involves the construction of earthen ovens in migrant shelters along the US-Mexico border. The idea is that we construct these mud ovens and we allow a community to be formed in the shelters amongst people who are coming from different countries. So in a migrant shelter, in this particular one where we're building here, there are people from Guatemala, from Mexico, from South America, from Cuba, and even from Russia in this case. And so they're coming from all over the world, and they're stuck in a shelter, and they need something around which they can build a community. And food is that thing, but also this technology is familiar to people across the Americas, but also beyond the Americas as well, as I mentioned. And so what we're doing is we're not only building ovens, but as the nun who runs the shelter said in that little video, when she's asked, what are we building here? The obvious answer may have been the mud oven, but she says, what are we building? And she takes a while to think about it. And she says, we're not building something, we're rebuilding something. What we're rebuilding is community. We're rebuilding people. We're rebuilding them emotionally and physically because they've endured a very hard journey and now they're here. And so this is just a little piece of home that they have before they continue on their journey. And it also has begun to be a way that they're reinforcing their own cultures and sharing those cultures with others in the community through making breads, through making meats, through making foods. And they're making so much bread, and this oven you can put in almost 100 loaves at a time. They're starting to share this food with others outside of this community. And so bringing people together around earth is kind of a central theme here. We're really interested in to think about how we use earth to make things, everything from an horno cooks food, but also what about the objects or the functional ceramics that one might cook food in. And so several years ago, we were involved in a project that involved the University of Texas, El Paso, and geology professors there and ceramic professors, and also about 25 potters from Juarez, Mexico, and from El Paso, Texas. These are the sister cities at the border. And we went around looking for traditional clay deposits and new clay deposits and found this amazing complexion of clays from whites to browns and tans, reds, even greens in one case. I might have a photo. And we asked the potters to 3D print at least 1 or 2 pots. In order for that to happen, we created this small app that runs in the cloud, because a ceramic artist typically doesn't know how to model or use a 3D printer. They have a whole other set of skills and crafts. So we made this little application, which now is used at schools and universities all over the world, called Potterware. Maybe I'll drop the link in the chat a little bit later, where they could just slide around. And we thought they would make 1 or 2 objects, but they ended up making almost 270 objects over the course of this project. And so these are some examples of these objects that are, in many cases, and can be functional pottery in which you could cook in, for example, or use in a number of ways. And so it builds upon a several thousand-year-old tradition of making pottery in the borderlands. So these techniques and skills of using software to make, and a 3D printer to make ceramics, have asked us questions about what are the applications in architecture. And so we're starting to explore this idea, and in one scenario through this project called the Cabin of 3D Printed Curiosities. And this is a project that takes many of our experiments in 3D printing using the materials around us, like being able to dig up clay out of the ground or other materials that might be found in the landscape. And I'll talk a little bit about them in just a bit, but this small cabin, which responds to the housing emergency in the San Francisco Bay Area, where they have lifted zoning regulations where if you can build up to 1,200 square feet as an accessory dwelling unit without the need of an architect or without going before the planning board in the county. And so we experimented with making over 4,000 of these ceramic tiles that are hung onto the surface as a rain screen using a 3D printed backing. And they have this woven technique that we innovated about 6 years ago. The front facade of this cabin has small tiles that are made of recycled sawdust and also recycled Chardonnay grape skins from the wine production in Sonoma and Napa Valleys in California. And also a technique that we patented using a 3D printed cement. And so there's a various range of hues and textures of these tiles, and they all hold succulents and air plants that grow very well in the Northern California climate. And they grow and they change. The building has actually become a kind of ecology unto itself. It's nestled in its own ecology in the California landscape. The interior of the house is made out of a bioplastic made out of corn, and so it biodegrades, but it also has this amazing translucency to it, so that we can set different kinds of moods within the cabin. The cabin itself is almost like a lantern itself, and so each of the interior tiles, very much like pressed tin tiles, all have a slight relief, but in this case, where you might have to make a single mold to make thousands of pressed tin of the same pattern, we are making these tiles and each one is unique. You can see the cabin during the day. This is what the cabin looks like at night with a kind of backlit daylight setting. The furniture is also 3D printed. The chairs, the coffee table. We have a coffee pot and a coffee cup made out of 3D printed recycled coffee grounds. And it transforms into a place to sleep. That's the cabin of 3D printed curiosities. So how can we take this idea even further, not only printing the ceramic components, but thinking about how the ground itself can be the material to print the actual house. Very much like the old houses that still exist in the borderlands that are made of the earth itself, the adobe houses. So we've embarked on a project, and I remember mentioning to you, Aaron, when we met, and we said, oh, maybe we come back for the next Biennale, and I thought, oh, what is it going to be at that point? Like, maybe we could just print these enormous things at that time. And that kind of sparked this idea of, could this be possible? You know, this idea that we're not only printing the ceramic vessels, but could we make a ceramic building at a single shot? Now, there's lots of problems that we had to overcome. One, we had to develop a machine that was able to do that, something that was portable, that went out into the landscape, that could print objects larger than itself. And so we worked with a manufacturer who's willing to take this idea on, and we developed a printer that could do just that, that could print very large objects. And so once we refined this technology and was able to solve the problems of how do you push massive amounts of clay through a 3D printer, we took it back to the borderlands. And for the first time in the history of the planet, we're 3D printing adobe in a landscape where adobe and ceramic have been used for thousands of years, building buildings right out of the very ground itself. And not only the buildings themselves, but functional pottery that could be used for cooking in. So we're 3D printing the kiln in which we're firing the ceramic pottery that's harvested from the landscape itself. And so I'm just going to walk you through a few of these experiments, because these are like small scale study models, to tell you just what we're thinking here in some of these experiments. One is really about lightness, and lightness in two ways that we're thinking. One, what does it mean just to illuminate these buildings that are very remote using solar powered LED, and what does that mean for this to be kind of beacons in the landscape? But also, building with earth is traditionally an endeavor that uses a lot of mass and material. but this particular structure is only 3 inches thick. And so because we're able to corrugate the material, like a corrugated metal that gives its own strength, the corrugated clay has a much stronger, has a greater strength, and we're able to print an 8-foot tall structure using 3 inches of material. In this experiment, we're thinking about the beacon, what it means for these objects to emerge from the landscape itself, but what does it mean also to 3D print something like stairs that we could walk up. I told you about the kiln earlier and our ability to 3D print functional ceramics in the way that ceramics have been made by hand for thousands of years, which is through coiled ceramic pottery. But now the coil is done by a robot, but the material is still harvested from the mountains, and it's micaceous clay that withstands a heat shock of fire. And so these can actually be used for cooking directly in or on fire. In this experiment, we had 2 whites of a very thin wall with a very subtle corrugation. And I was actually worried about its strength. And we had all this leftover cedar wood from the ceramic firing. And so we just simply dropped it in place based on the undulating pattern of the surface to hold the 2 whites together. But this is also a project that's about building program. How do you 3D print furniture? How do you print programmed space, a hearth where people can gather around? And during the time of COVID, this became our studio, the borderland landscape itself. And these became our study models. And the land became our desk in which we're displaying, evaluating, exploring the possibility of making accessible, inexpensive structures in the same way that have been done for thousands of years in this landscape. I'm going to scrub ahead just a little bit because this experiment is about trabeating the earth, about giving it an incline so we can make something like a door without any lintel, or attempting to create a dome and enclosing the space itself. And so the last experiment that I'll show you is really about how we can make a much more efficient printing process. Typically in the desert, on a sunny, windy day, we could print about 16 inches tall, and then we have to wait for that mud to dry a little bit. And really it's just mud. It's the ground, which has clay and sand and silt mixed with a little bit of straw. It's like the same material that might be used in wattle and daub or cob in the UK. But this experiment, instead of waiting, we built this 4th axis, this very inexpensive rail. And because the robot itself is very lightweight, we could print, move the robot, print again, move the robot. And suddenly we were printing 3 of these structures and spaces in the same amount of time that it took to print 1. This is just a quick walkthrough as we're building and making this. The robot is very lightweight. It's operated by the cell phone. Here you see we're going up. Final layer. And this last experiment is called Casa Covida. Covida for me means cohabitation. It looks like COVID, but it is a house for cohabitation in the time of COVID. House or retreat for 2 people. Casa Covida is built in a remote landscape from the earth itself. It has a space for sleeping, for looking out into the landscape. The textiles you see were a collaboration with an indigenous weaver who we proposed that we would weave the plan of the Casa Covida onto the textiles themselves using a local churro wood. This hearth is a space for gathering for 2 people. It has 3D printed earthen furniture covered in textiles, and a hearth on which you can cook in using the functional pottery that was 3D printed. And the 3rd space is a space for bathing. It's a place where one can see the sky, the stars, and enjoy soaking the warm waters within Casa Covida. And what about a roof? That's the question every architect asks. And we had many iterations of what a roof might be, but I think in the borderlands, there's this tension and hybrid, and the house is born from bringing a 3D printer to a place where mud has been used for thousands of years. And now that we have this mud house, we decided we would make this lightweight pneumatic as the roof, a kind of cherry on top that brought in this amazing quality of light into the space, but also blocked the wind and rain and snow. So that's Casa Covida, a house for cohabitation in the time of COVID. While we were doing this experiments, there was always in our news and maybe around the world, continued conversation about building more wall and especially separating children from their parents at the US-Mexico border. And we were in a remote location, not able to participate in the protests that were taking place. And we decided that we would make an open source protest sign for our friends to use during the protest in California and New York. And we wanted to build upon this particular sign because in the United States, this is a very iconic sign in the borderlands and maybe around the world. And it's often used to riff upon, to express different kinds of political ideas. And so we wanted to use this sign as well. But we looked into the history of the design of this sign, which is really interesting. It was designed by a Native American graphic designer from New Mexico named John Hood, who was Navajo and saw the plight of the immigrant today as that the Navajo during the long walk when they were forced to migrate from their own homelands and placed on reservations. He smuggled in activism into this sign. There was thoughtful moves like putting a little girl with pigtails because he thought that's who motorists might empathize with the most. And of course, this sign was made because the California Highway Department was worried about immigrants who were dropped off alongside the road and would run across the highway and attempt to get off the road, and to warn motorists that they might see that. But the father, the head of the father, is the silhouette of the civil rights leader Cesar Chavez. And so we wanted to build upon the genius of this sign as a kind of form of activism. And we made one simple move, which was turn the family to face each other and place reunite to speak to this issue. Now, one thing that was happening when we were designing this sign is the last of those signs, original signs, were being removed from the highway. But we made this open source. People started downloading them, using it in protest. And it started to spread a little bit, almost viral in a way. And we started to make larger signs that we were going to place alongside the highway, especially along the roadsides adjacent to some of the child detention centers. But it received such attention that we were able to participate in the Four Freedoms campaign, which is the largest public art campaign in the world. And we were able to bring this message back to the highway in ways that we would have never expected, in the form of an enormous billboard for hundreds of thousands of people to see. And the word of reunite continues to spread. You can see it today on the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City on 110th and Amsterdam. People are downloading this sign and continuing to place it on street signs throughout Los Angeles. And it became the facade of the Johnson Museum in Cornell, New York, for an exhibition on border art, but slightly controversial because of the message that was embedded in it. And it was almost felt like the museum itself was protesting, which aptly it should. Part of this idea of smuggling in design into the context where one would not normally find activism is embedded in a project that we call Teeter-Totter Wall. I mentioned the book Border Walls Architecture up front, and where there are more than 700 miles of border wall constructed along the US-Mexico border today at enormous cost of up to $4 million per mile for this steel and sometimes concrete wall. And in that biography of this wall, I mentioned the various stories that were emerging from its construction, the way people responded to the wall, the ecologies that it threatened. And it's a book that's filled with the stories and filled with illustrations of those stories that were done by my studio. One of the illustrations was an illustration that we called teeter-totter that spoke to the idea of the border as a metaphorical fulcrum between US-Mexico relations, that talked about the scales of justice that exist or don't exist at the border, the labor and trade balances and immigration balances that exist at the border, and the equities and inequities between wealth and poverty between Mexicans and Americans at the US-Mexico border. So this was one illustration that we did, speaking metaphorically of those issues, and a souvenir, we call them, a recuerdo. Recuerdo also means a memory of the time we built the border wall and what a ridiculous idea that was. Like the reunite sign, this particular message continued to be told, and people really shared and kind of latched on to this idea of the teeter-totter wall. And we were asked by several arts organizations if we would like to see this project realized. And we attempted to do so since about 2017, but the Department of Homeland Security and the US Border Patrol always said no, that they would not allow this to happen. But we wanted to see what it would mean to actually allow this object, which was drawn and modeled, to exist in the world, and what it would mean to take that idea further, to think about how we would smuggle in this concept to the border, how we might slip it through the wall, how we might make it out of the same material that the wall is made out of, how we would add seats and handlebars to it. And we collaborated with an art collective in Juarez, Mexico called Colectivo Chopeque to work to realize this as an object. This is the very first ride of the teeter-totter in the studio in Juarez, the metal shop in Juarez, Mexico. And then the question is, how do you smuggle it to the border? If you see this monument here, that monument marks the border between the United States and Mexico. Half of that monument is in Mexico, the other half is in the United States. So you can see those footprints next to it in the sand. That person was standing in the United States on the Mexico side of the border. And there's about 44,000 acres of United States land on the Mexican side of the wall. But if you look closer, you can see that literal fulcrum of US-Mexico relations that we attach to this wall, anticipating the arrival of an event to foster these relationships across this divide. As we developed this project, originally it was made out of rusty steel, just like the wall itself. But then we decided to allow it to stand apart from the wall through the use of color. And we had a lot of conversations about that, especially with Colectivo Chopeque and what colors mean in that landscape. And we elected to use hot pink. Hot pink because it stood apart from the wall, but in Juarez, that color has a very special and important meaning. It's used to remember the women who were killed in the femicides during the time of violence in Juarez. So we wanted to recognize that while we were using play as a form of activism and resistance, that we were doing it in a landscape that was in a landscape of violence and oppression, the violence of the architecture of the wall and the oppressive nature of the wall itself. And so without any permission, without any notice to anyone, we decided one day that we would simply go and attach this teeter-totter to the wall, have an event with families and children on both sides. And this is how it happened. The moment I dropped that teeter-totter into that fulcrum, there was already a child putting his leg over and starting to ride. The event was attended mostly by mothers and children on both sides. And what I learned from this event is that, especially when the US Border Patrol arrived and asked what we were doing, we said we were having an event with the children and the families. And they stood back and pulled their car over and took some pictures and watched and smiled. A little bit later, the Mexican National Guard arrived, heavily armed. You'll see them in a bit in this clip. asking what was going on here, and we said we're having an event with children and mothers, and they too smiled and stood back. And what happened was a sanctuary formed in that space. If the wall is architecture, walls define spaces and kind of program those spaces. But we can think about how we could transform those walls to transform those spaces for good, because the wall is public space, and we say what goes on in those spaces. While the leader of the previous regime in the United States said that the only thing that's happening in the borders is that bad men are doing bad things in a place where no one lives, we're able to communicate to the world that, in fact, this is a place where mothers and children and grandmothers live with their families and experience joy despite the violence and oppression of the wall. And for 40 minutes that day, accidentally, by posting this picture to Instagram, we're able to transcend that place in that moment and show the world that the actions that take place on one side of the wall have a direct consequence on the other. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ronald. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I think we've got a couple of questions that we want to put to you, but I'll just kick it off if I may. Just thinking about the wall itself, I think you've been quite articulate about this not being the installation not being a political act necessarily, but more a protest about the nature of borders, in a sense, or false lines on a map, which perhaps might even be something that we've obsessed about a lot with in the last year with COVID times as well. I wondered if you could just sort of talk through that a little bit more about what the nature of the statement behind the teeter-totter.
Sure, it's certainly I would say that it's certainly a political act. Definitely, it's an act of resistance. It's an act that I think disempowers the wall and transforms the wall. It dismantles the wall. If the wall is made as an instrument to keep people apart and away and divided, we demonstrated that just a simple moment can trump that power, can disempower the violence of that wall for just a moment. So it absolutely is a message to be sent. I was having a conversation just the other day with a journalist who was telling me about, he's writing a story about ladders, because there are stretches along the border where you find piles of ladders. And there was a joke in 2006 by then the head of the Department of Homeland Security, when they were first discussing the construction of a wall. He said, show me a 30-foot wall and I'll show you a 31-foot ladder. And that reality has proven true, because they find hundreds of ladders along the border every day, where this wall that cost $1 million is overcome by a ladder made out of 2x4s, and people are climbing them over. But that's very typical. If you might find a fence that is 20 foot high that's meant to stop vehicles, and there are portable bridges that are pulled up to the border. You might find that the walls are constructed to stop the movement of drugs, but there are catapults that simply throw drugs over the wall. And so I think in all those cases, there's this idea of stopping movement. But another consequence of the wall is that it stops people from coming together. Juarez and El Paso was one city at one time. Many of the people consider themselves to be one people. There's an ecology that extends. So can we also develop technologies that allow us to connect and demonstrate the ridiculous nature of that wall? And I think those conversations, while they don't dismantle the wall itself, they begin to allow us to have the conversation, do we need a wall in the first place? And look at everything that it's dismantling in some of the most pristine landscapes in the United States.
There's a question I've just seen at the bottom of the chat from Aaron Chetwynd, which I think it kind of follows on from that point. So I'm going to take the questions out of order, if that's okay. But Erin, do you want to just put that question to Ron that you've just put in the chat?
Yeah, sure. I was saying, hi Ron. Great talk, by the way. Fantastic.
Hey.
Really, really enjoyable. I was saying, did you win some prestigious award for Titter Totter? And was that also a political recognition from the new regime as Trump left? I think I read something about that.
Yeah. Well, I think we did win a prestigious award for that project, the Beazley Award, which is given by the Design Museum in London, which we were very surprised by. The announcement of that award came the day before Biden's inauguration. And so that caused quite a stir in the press, I think. And what was really exciting, I think, at that moment, like building upon the momentum of that award and that recognition, was that very day, his first day in office, he stopped all construction of the wall along the US-Mexico border. And so that was pretty exciting. Maybe it had nothing to do with our project. I'm sure it did. But I'm sure maybe Biden has seen the teeter-totter wall. I mean, it has actually started to emerge as a symbol of connection. And there's a movie on the home box office network in the United States. It's about a lawyer who's an undocumented citizen in the United States, but the poster of the movie is a pink teeter-totter. And I wrote them and I said, is this a reference? And they said, it's absolutely a reference. So there's like ways that these ideas can be smuggled into a larger conversation. And now I think the project has to continue, because the moment that Biden stopped the construction of the wall, all the contractors left, and what's left in the landscape are huge piles of steel and mountains in pristine desert landscapes that are blown up, and they're just there. Everything is just stopped, and people have walked away. And so I think a future project for architects and designers is to think about how we reconnect those landscapes, how we heal those landscapes, what we do with the scars that are in those landscapes. The scars are memories. We all might have scars on our bodies, and we think about the stories that gave us those scars, and we negotiate those scars in different ways. Some people put tattoos, some people hide them, some people show them off, some people really like them and think they're sexy, you know. But I think ultimately we have to deal with those scars ourselves that we have placed in our landscapes. Thanks, Erin, for that question.
Ron, we've also got a question from Nigel Ostheim about 3D printing. So Nigel, if I could just invite you to unmute and put that to Ron.
Yeah, here we go. Hi, Ron. Love the work that you're doing. It's really brilliant work. I'm an architect in a reasonably large practice in London, and we love collaborating with other architects and artists. So it'd be fantastic that one day we managed to do that with you. But anyway, my question was about 3D printing, which it hasn't really started happening as a means of house building at any sort of scale. Do you see it being used at a larger scale as a solution for affordable housing, for example, in a more dense urban setting, or do you know of anywhere where this is happening? Because it seems to be emerging still.
I would say that first part of your question is maybe just related to the UK, because in the United States, there are several companies that are building massive amounts of housing, not only in the United States, but in Mexico. And of course, in China, they're doing this as well. And it's starting to happen in Latin America and in other countries in the East, India, for example. And so I think it's taking off. And just 2 days ago, the largest development in the US was announced in Southern California. So the question for me is not, is it happening or will it happen? But my question is, how will it happen? And if we think about the last 150 years of construction in the United States, concrete has been the chief material. And today there are conversations about the use of concrete because it's one of the greatest contributors to greenhouse gases. And suddenly we have this new emerging technology that holds so much promise. But the problem for me is that that promise is being displayed by using a material that still has all the problems associated with it. So everyone is 3D printing concrete. And the questions are, who wants to live in houses made of concrete, and why, and what's their compatibility with the environment and with the occupants of those dwellings, when we have seen massive housing developments throughout the developing world made out of concrete block that are abandoned or uncomfortable or fall to the wayside. We've seen its contributions to the ecology and the atmosphere in the form of greenhouse gas emission. So this is why I'm proposing an alternative route, that we don't look back at the way we build things in the last 150 years, but we look back at the way we constructed things for the last 10,000 years. And the technology would allow that material to enter into contemporary culture. So that's my goal. How can we bring an ancient material into the context of contemporaneity instead of taking a modern material like concrete and rehashing it through the media of a new technology?
A similar
Thanks,
point from Juliet as well, which has just come in, connected with 3D printing. Juliet, do you want to put that question to Ron?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm an architecture student. I've heard a lot about Adobe and how people build buildings with it. And I was just interested because it creates like connection between people when they build with Adobe. And so I was just thinking about how you use 3D printers, and it kind of changes the whole process. Yeah, so that's just basically what I'm asking. Don't you think that by using 3D printers, we lose this connection and process?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's like this connection to the hand and the material, and I don't see that connection going away. I've actually found that when you're using the printer, you're really actively engaging in the tool itself and the way you're shaping the building. And so it's mediated, but I don't find that it's disconnected from making. I actually find that there's even a kind of greater excitement and intimacy with the building. But I think there are also questions that arise that are similar to yours about labor, like in developing worlds, don't you need labor? But I think there are different kinds of labor that can be formed. I think there are different kinds of efficiencies for this, the issues of safety that are made. So there is, I will call it a romantic notion of a traditional village and community where everyone's coming together and building a house. I don't think everyone lives in that scenario. I think the movement towards concrete block houses is because many people who lived in those communities don't practice an agrarian lifestyle that connects them to the land. They go work in a bank, they go work in a factory, and so they can't maintain the house in the same way. And therefore they can't build the house in the same way that they did. And that has supplanted that traditional material. So what I would like to think is that this technology actually reconnects them to all the beautiful aspects of the technology, of the material technology, which is its ability to serve as a thermal mass, to buffer heat, to be inexpensive, to have that connection with the material that we have evolved with for 10,000 more years as human beings. But without all of the side effects and consequences of building in concrete. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. And Maria Gasparian, the question about 3D printed ceramics. Maria? Have we lost Maria? Is she still with us?
I can read the question. I see the question.
Oh, I can talk. Can you see me? Hello?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me and see me? Hi, Ron. How are you? I was extremely fortunate to visit Ron several years ago in Berkeley and see his wonderful workshop. Was fascinated since, and I still follow your work. I'm a big fan. It's great to see you. Thank you very much for the talk. Coming from rainy England, Ron, unfortunately, it is a problem building with unfired clay here. So I'm going to ask you about fired ceramics. And the workshop that we visited in Buffalo obviously discussed creation of fired ceramics. And I know your experimental practice is unbelievable. It's so, it has no boundaries, obviously. But we live in a world where everything is tested and, it has to be watertight, it has to be load-bearing. Do you see, I mean, I know that you do so much experimental work. Do you actually manage to push it through one step further to make it actually buildable in terms of using in, again, in housing or in the buildings, something that Boston Valley Terracotta are pushing, but in more experimental way. So I'm talking about 3D printed ceramics that can be used in buildings. What is your outlook? How far we are from actually managing it in real buildings and architecture?
Sure. I mean, the first part of your question is interesting because I think of the UK as the home of wattle and daub, where all of London was made out of raw clay. And I think about the UK as the home of cob, where there are amazing structures made out of that material, and also rammed earth material. I think of some of the more recent buildings that have been constructed there. And so there's this very deep tradition of building with the raw clay in the UK for its environmental relationships, its ability to absorb humidity. So that part I think a lot of promise for even wet, humid places like the UK. And the question about the ceramics are simply made in the same way that ceramics at larger scales are made. They're extruded and they are fired and they are waterproof. And so I see no difference in making a ceramic component that's extruded through in a mass production scale and sliced, and one that's extruded at a smaller scale with 3D printers and are fired to the same temperatures, the same material. So I don't think that will be an enormous leap to cross. And there have already been plenty of examples in the Netherlands and other places that are using 3D printing to make ceramic objects and using particular glazes or certain clay bodies to do that. And so when you're building with raw earth, like in the case of cob or adobe, those are already specified in the International Building Code. And so I also see that to be a very easy translation to, I don't see the code for a 3D printed adobe building very different than that of those specified in the IBC for cob or adobe. And we have tested the strength of that material in compression, which exceeds the compression levels for the International Building Code.
Really?
And I don't know why it's stronger, but I have this sense that just like when you wedge clay and you're pushing the clay particles together and that's strengthening the clay, that the extruder on the 3D printer is also kind of wedging and compressing that material before it comes out of the nozzle. So the difference between an adobe building packed by hand and that's coming out of the nozzle is markedly different.
Amazing. Oh, great. Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I think we've just got time for one more, and there is a question from Sarah Misran. And Sarah, if you'd like to put that to Ron.
Yeah, hi, Ron. So I just wanted to know, with your experience with working with immigration and refugee projects, how do you think that we should prepare our cities for future influx of migrants, maybe even climate change migrants? What do you think could be an effective solution instead of these makeshift accommodations that refugees get placed at? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a good and hard question because I think the approach to creating hospitality at the border has been to only respond to the most pragmatic needs: a roof, a wall, and some food. And it's left in a very base and fundamental level. I think there are many more needs that should expand that idea of hospitality, that should build community. I think that it should include health and wellness, not only physical health and wellness, but emotional and psychological health and wellness. So when we see, just to give a description, it's really sad and horrific. And this has existed for a very long time at the border, whether they're separating children from their families or not. People are sleeping on concrete floors or cots with hundreds of cots in one space, or those cages are real. The food is kind of mass produced and poor nutrition quality, and that's about it. And these are warehouses, these are prisons. And I think that we need to think much more humanistically about these spaces, especially if we're architects and designers, that there needs to be places for healing, for reunification, to address the psychological and emotional trauma that families experience at the border, not only if their parents are separated from their children, but in the traumas, the journeys that they have taken and everything that has happened along the way. And so I think we need to make those kinds of programs. How we build those programs, what materials, I would like to think that we can, because in the United States, many of these areas are in regions where earth has been a traditional building practice. And in working with the communities and shelters along the US-Mexico border, and because everyone is stuck, there is a lot of interest in those communities owning, and when I say owning, taking ownership of creating their world. And in the case of constructing that horno, which is one small piece of that world, the entire community showed up and built that horno together. Before I even arrived, they made 600 bricks because we've actually built 2 of them there. And there was a moment where we had to transport 600 bricks about 300 yards, or 300 meters, sorry. And the entire community made a line and they just handed the bricks. And in 15 minutes, 600 40-pound bricks were moved a great distance, for everything with children and mothers. And so I think it's a way that communities can build together. And that goes back to the question that was asked. We're actually putting together a proposal about 3D printing a house in those communities. And the walls are just a small part of the building. And we have to sift the mud, we have to bring the mud, and there's woodwork, there's steel work. So I think the community building aspect of it can, certainly transcend a printer, but it involves materials that make sense and programs that make sense. Thank you, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ron. There is one final question, which is Aaron Chetwin wonders whether you would be interested in helping NASA out with 3D printing buildings on Mars, which sounds like quite an enticing prospect. But I wondered whether that might be your next career move, Ronald.
I mean, it's interesting. I think there's a lot of housing issues on Earth. I think there's a lot of ways that we can think about anti-colonization instead of colonization. So maybe I'm going to stick to that project for a while. The issues that are happening on our planet, and try not to do them in a colonizing way, instead of trying to colonize another planet with their own resources.
Ron, it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to hear from you again, and we're so pleased that you were able to spend the time with us this evening or this afternoon on USA time. Thank you also to everyone who has signed up and joined us today. We do have a few more talks lined up by a practice called Aleph Zero, who are based in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and talking about the work that they're doing, in particular in building brick schools in the rainforest, which hopefully will be a fascinating event. So do please have a look for details of that, either through our newsletters or on our social media channels. And in the meantime, thank you, Ron, again, for a really interesting and absorbing presentation. I think it was thoroughly enjoyed by all.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, everyone. Brilliant. Great to see so many people. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone.